Alright guys, we are going to go through our Chapter 6, Section 1 notes on Darwin's theory. You can follow along with this or you can follow along with the PowerPoint slides in the folder. If you're ready to go, you should have a copy of the notes and you can follow along. So, to introduce who Charles Darwin is, in December 1831, there was a British ship called the HMS Beagle that was going on a 5-year trip from England around the world. So Charles Darwin at the time was 22 years old, and he was on this ship working, and then he eventually became the ship's naturalist. So as the years went on, and through his studies, he became this person who studies the natural world and made observations and discoveries about the world around him. So he observed plants and animals that he had never seen before, and so he began to wonder why they were so different from the ones in England, why they had different variations, different varieties, or plants that weren't even in England. So his observations then led him to develop one of the most important scientific theories of all time, which is the theory of evolution by natural selection. Generally, we just call it the theory of evolution, and then we understand what the process of natural selection is. So his observations, he again looked at those plants and living things. He also thought about the relationships among those organisms, how they were similar, how they were different, and how they interacted with each other. So other observations that he made included the diversity of living things, so how there were so many different varieties and different species, the remains of ancient organisms, so looking at fossils and different components of ancient organisms. And then he even specifically looked at different characteristics of organisms on the Galapagos Islands as they went around that. And that was one of his big studies for his theory. So the diversity, he was amazed by the diversity he saw. And today, as scientists continue to discover new species and make new observations and discoveries, we have identified more than 1.7 million species of organisms on Earth. And just as a reminder, a definition, a species is a group of similar organisms that can mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. So they can mate and reproduce, and then their offspring would be able to mate and reproduce with that same species as well. So Darwin also looked at fossils, and these are those ancient organisms and discoveries of that. So he was able to see bones, and a fossil is a preserved remain or trace of an organism that lived in the past. So he was kind of confused by some of the fossils. He noticed that they were much larger than animals that like he had observed that were living, specifically the ground sloth. If you remember from our Bill Nye video yesterday, the ground sloth was very, very large in ancient times, but then today, if you've ever seen a sloth, you know they're not very big. So he noticed that there were differences in size, and that kind of sparked his curiosity as well. Then, looking at the organisms on the Galapagos Islands, so this was nearing the end of the trip because this is in 1835 and the trip started in 1831. The Beagle, so the HMS Beagle, that ship reached the Galapagos Islands, and he was able to make many different observations. He specifically looked at giant tortoises, he looked at iguanas, and even some different types of birds. So what he did was he compared the organisms on the Galapagos Islands to organisms that lived elsewhere, either in England or other places around the world that he knew of. He also compared the different Galapagos Island organisms to each other to see how variations happened across the islands. So, um, he also did comparisons to South American organisms, looking at the birds, which include hawks, mockingbirds, and finches. And he noticed that they resembled those on the mainland. So the Galapagos Islands and then the mainland of South America, he was able to kind of compare and see some similarities and differences. He also noticed that plants were similar to other plants that he had collected and made observations of, but there were differences between organisms on the island and those on the mainland. So, looking at iguanas specifically, he noticed that the Galapagos Islands, iguanas there had very large claws, which allowed them to grip on the slippery rocks, and then they fed on seaweed. So they actually dive into the water and can like hold their breath, and they get seaweed in the water or along the edge of the rocks, but they need those strong claws to help them grip. But then iguanas on the mainland had smaller claws, um, and they mainly climbed trees and they ate leaves. So they're still the same species, but they have different characteristics. So, from his observations, Darwin began to hypothesize that a small number of different plants and animal species had come to the Galapagos Islands from the mainland. He reasoned that they could have either blown out to sea during a storm, or maybe they were set adrift and they were floating across the water and got separated from the mainland. So then, once they reached the islands, they began to reproduce and continue to grow, and then their offspring eventually became different from their mainland relatives. And we're going to kind of get into how they became different. Um, so, comparing then among the different islands, they traveled from one island to the next. Darwin noticed differences between the islands. So some of the tortoises, those big turtles, some had dome-shaped shells, while other had like saddle-shaped shells. And then one of the government officials, this is really cool, told Darwin that they could actually identify which island a tortoise came from just by looking at its shell and looking at the different features and the shape of how the shells had changed. They could tell where that tortoise came from. So these um, these differences and variations are called adaptations. So one of the other things um, that Darwin studied were finches in the Galapagos Islands, and he noticed that they were very different from the different islands. And the differences that he noticed were the various sizes and shapes of their beaks. So, through his observations and examining finches, he was able to see that each species was suited to the life that it led in its specific location. So, some finches on the islands that ate mainly insects, they had very narrow needle-like beaks to kind of grab or poke at the insects, whereas some finches that had or ate seeds then had strong, wide beaks to help crack those seeds or nuts and get the food that they needed. So you can see the variations in their beaks here. These are 4 different species of finches, and they're all very similar, but they have noticeable differences. So a bird beak or the bird shape, the beak shape, is an example of an adaptation, which is a trait that helps the organism survive and reproduce. So the finch's beak structure helps it obtain food. There are other adaptations that animals can have that help them avoid being eaten. So they might have like a camouflage or certain markings that like ward off predators. And then there's a variety of adaptations that aid in reproduction. Some birds have very colorful feathers and like different rituals that they complete to attract a mate and help them stand out. Whereas like others have special reproductive adaptations. So Darwin's reasoning on evolution, he reasoned that plants or animals that arrived on the Galapagos Islands faced conditions that were different from those on the mainland. So through those different conditions, he hypothesized that the species had to gradually change over many generations to become better adapted to the new conditions. And he called that gradual change in a species evolution. So his ideas are often referred to as the theory of evolution, and a scientific theory, which this um, is a well-tested concept that explains a wide range of observations. So from the evidence he collected, he was able to conclude that organisms on the Galapagos Islands had changed over time, or they had evolved, or they adapted to better meet their needs. So, through this, Darwin also studied other examples of changes in living things so he could understand how evolution occurred. So, he studied the offspring of animals produced by selective breeding. And this, by repeatedly allowing only pigeons with many tail feathers to mate, breeders had produced pigeons with 2 or 3 times the usual number of tail feathers. If you remember back from chapter 5, we talked about um, selective breeding and cloning and how like we can cross organisms together to get those desired traits, and that's what these breeders did. They wanted pigeons with many tail feathers, so they picked and chose um, those specific pigeons that continued to produce a large amount of tail feathers, and they continued to breed them to have that offspring. So Darwin thought that a process similar to selective breeding might actually happen in nature. So natural selection in 1858, Darwin and another British biologist, Alfred Russel Wallace, proposed an explanation for how evolution could occur in nature. Then, the next year, Darwin described this mechanism in a book titled The Origin of Species. And he proposed that evolution occurred by means of natural selection. Okay, or if you've ever heard the term survival of the fittest, that's where this comes from. So, natural selection is the process by which individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce than other members of the same species. Darwin identified specific factors that affected the process of natural selection, and these factors are overproduction, competition, and variation. So, overproduction means that the more species um, or species that produce more offspring can possibly survive longer. Or they're going to have a better chance of survival because there's more of them. So in many species, so many offspring are produced that there are not enough resources, such as food, water, and living space, for all of them. So this overproduction then, in insects, they lay thousands of eggs, and if all of those insects survived, they would crowd out all the other plants and animals. So Darwin knew that that didn't happen, but he wondered why. So with overproduction, this is kind of an example with baby sea turtles. Turtles lay many, many eggs, but know that not all of the young will survive because um, there's different factors that affect those turtles. So the difference between individuals of the same species is called a variation. So for example, certain insects may be able to eat foods that other insects of their species avoid. The color of a few insects may be different from that of other insects in their species based on where they're located or what type of environment they live in. And then competition is another factor. So since food and other resources are limited, the members of a species have to compete with each other to survive. Now, this competition doesn't mean they're going to get into like a direct fight with each other and battle it out. Competition is usually indirect. It means that there's not enough of that resource. So there's not enough water, there's not enough food, there's not enough living space. Um, Others might be caught by predators, and so only a few of those organisms survive, or they get pushed out of that area because they're weaker or they get killed off. So then, with that competition and selection with the turtles, um, when you have the overproduction, there's a large number of those turtles. Each of them has some slight variations. If they make it to the water without getting eaten by seagulls and other birds, then they also have to compete with one another to survive and be faster um, and watch out from getting eaten by other organisms in the water. Um, and then turtles have other variations on if they're bigger in size or faster, and that helps them survive. So then, based on all of those factors, it kind of all comes together. So, with this selection process, Darwin observed that some variations that individuals had made them better adapted to their environment. And so these individuals then were more likely to survive and reproduce. And then their offspring usually inherit the helpful characteristics. So then, as those offspring and generations continue to reproduce, more members of the species will have helpful characteristics, and that will take over. So then they have adapted and changed to meet their environmental needs. So, in this process, then the environment has essentially selected organisms with helpful traits to become parents of the next generation. So Darwin proposed that over a long time, natural selection can lead to change, or those variations and those adaptations to help the species survive. So helpful variations may gradually accumulate in a species, while unfavorable ones may disappear. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the species no longer has that that unfavorable characteristic. It just means that there's not as many organisms with that trait. They either don't have it anymore, like if you remember with the dominant and recessive alleles, that trait is either masked so you can't see it, or they got picked off by predators, or they didn't make it through competition and things like that. So, environmental change, um, this can also affect how an organism survives. So, an environmental change can also lead to selection. So, monkey flowers are a type of plant, and they cannot grow in a soil that has a high concentration of copper. So because of genetic variation, though, some varieties of monkey flower now grow near copper mines in spite of the copper in the soil. So they adapted to overcome that resistance and found ways to be able to like handle the copper in the soil and grow. So through all this, without variations, all of the members of a species would have the same traits, and there would be no variety, there would be no differences. And because of that, then, that natural selection wouldn't occur because they would all have an equal chance of surviving and reproducing. There'd be no competition, there would be no issues with each other, essentially. So Darwin could not explain what caused variations or how they were passed on, but as scientists continued to study the theory of evolution and organisms, they learned that variations can result from mutations and also the shuffling of alleles during meiosis. So if you remember um, how that all works, genes are passed from parents to their offspring, and so, because of that, only traits that are inherited or controlled by genes can be acted upon by natural selection. So, it's not like an organism can just magically inherit something or change um, and mutate into something else to help them survive. They have to have that mutation or that trait, those genes, and they might just be masked because of a dominant allele, or they just may not be visible yet due to a mutation. Um, so once you are done with your notes, this is the end. We are going to be getting into other activities later this week to help understand this, but please make sure you have your notes filled out. If you need to go back in the video to do that, please make sure you get your 6.1 notes done and turned in.